Welcome to another episode of the Dentology podcast, where we discuss the business of dentistry. In this podcast series, we'll be discussing all the non-clinical aspects of dentistry, from goodwill values, finance, marketing, how to buy and sell a dental practice mindset, through to where you can invest your money in team management issues. My name is Andy Acton, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Strevens. Let's jump straight into it. Welcome to another episode of Dentology, the Business of Dentistry podcast. Today we're joined by Lis Hughes. Hello, Liz. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you guys?
Good to see you, Liz.
Very good indeed. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get into talking about practice values and dental practice sales and that whole world, could you perhaps just give us a bit of an introduction as to your background and how it was you ended up in dentistry?
Yeah, I've worked in legal services for many years on the management side, a bit like herding cats. And the firm I was working at in 2006, when there was a change in the contract, was a firm called RHW that only old people will probably remember now. And we specialised in, it was a general service law firm, but had a special interest in dentistry, a guy called Martin Whiteman, that you will know and love. So I worked there, and during the time I worked there, I got really quite interested in working with the dental side of it and that was my interest really and my way into dentistry.
Wow. So the stuff that you delivered for the law firm, that was on the business and marketing side of the law firm?
Yeah, because it was a full service law firm, we had 6 or 7 offices throughout the region where I worked. It was very much on the management side and communication and business development, which is still a probably dirty word in some law firms, but probably quite important.
A very important part of work, and isn't it? And the reality is that whatever industry, profession or business you're in, there has to be a business development, commercial dimension to it. Because if there isn't, then that's not running a viable business, is it?
Well, and you need strategy. And actually what you need is strategies that can be implemented into action, because it's really easy to put lots of strategies down on a piece of paper, but actually making them work, making them cohesive and actually engaging the people that are actually implementing the work in the strategies is really important. So business development is probably more like that than it is about going out for lunch or networking, which people tend to think that BD is.
Absolutely. So we were going to have a chat to you today about the goodwill of dental practices and you know what it means and what it is and where the market's at. I'm guessing that we're now coming out of lockdown and on the back of COVID. So there was an assumption that dental practice goodwill values were going to get absolutely slayed through that process. But before we get to that, just to kind of a little bit of context, what actually drives goodwill values? What is it that you know the inputs that matter to it?
I think the most basic driver is demand. So if you have a dental practice in the right area where there's a great demand, that will drive the goodwill value. The goodwill, we always say there's 2 lots of goodwill. One is the tangible one, so that's the evidence, that's the financial reports. And the other one is the intangible, which is the relationship within the practice, the relationship with the patients and relationships between the staff as well. But the big driver of goodwill has to be the demand of the market.
Typically, what's the demand like at the moment across the UK? Is it fairly flat, or is it high demand?
No, when we went into the first lockdown in March 2020, which seemed like a lifetime ago now, the general concern from everybody was we had no idea what was going to happen. And actually what surprised us was how many associates wanted to buy a practice, because they suddenly realised how vulnerable they were working as associates. We heard some great stories of practice owners who really looked after their associates. We heard other stories where practice owners didn't quite know what to do with their associates. But overall, what we saw was the vulnerability of the associates and the realisation that if they were a practice owner, they'd have more control of their own future. So we just saw a massive influx of young associates wanting to register, looking to buy a practice, which when we went into lockdown in March surprised everybody.
Did you find that there were sort of geographical variances that maybe weren't there before? Has that sort of changed?
I think in the past year, it's been quite interesting, and I don't think it's just dentistry. I think one of the things that we saw was regional dental practices If you think from June, when they're allowed to open again, regional practices were busier because people who maybe historically had worked in cities were working from home, that people who were taking advantage of their commute to visit their dentist no longer had to do that. So what we actually saw was, so city centres, particularly London, the city area, which has always been a very busy, popular area, was relatively quiet still because people weren't commuting. Whereas regionally, all the local practices were benefiting and actually building a larger patient base because people were working from home.
So a bit like houses in that sort of thing, that people were moving out, finding places with gardens and rooms. And that is that the same with dental practices? The areas that might not have been so popular before now became popular.
Without a doubt, and definitely when you spoke to dental practice owners within sort of the regional areas, they had all seen a benefit. So if you think of every city in the country, there are areas around there all benefiting.
And you were
from
saying
it.
about the buyers as a big influx of new buyers. Do you think that's possibly just a knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic, or do you think these people really want to buy? Because I guess from what you said, it sounds like there's a disconnect between the number of buyers that are out there relative to the number of practices. Because like I say, I know lots of people have had their lifestyle challenged in the last year. And I wonder whether some of those people that kind of said, I want to buy a practice, it was almost as kind of a reaction as opposed to they'd really gone through the process of thinking that they really do want a business.
I think it's a combination. I think there were certainly a few people that said, this is so scary, I want to be a practice owner. But overall, the ambition to be a practice owner has always been a very strong ambition of most associates that we deal with. I mean, pre-COVID, pre-lockdown in March, we were probably running with 4,700 associates registering, looking to buy within England and Wales. And certainly now we're way over 5,000. And because we actually vet everybody financially to make sure that their aspiration to buy a practice can be followed through with reality, these guys are committed to it because they've actually gone through a vetting process for us to be able to establish that they are in a position where they can buy a practice. So the ones that were knee-jerking, were very few and certainly were filtered out very quickly.
Yeah. And so flipping to the other side of the fence, we've got, this huge pool of buyers, and then you've got people who are also selling. But from a selling point of view, what are the characteristics of a practice that make it attractive to buyers? We've got these 5,000 people wanting to acquire a practice. What are those traits of a practice that make it desirable?
It's really quite interesting because it's a massive combination of personal reasons and commercial reasons. So from one point of view, people are looking to buy because it's an area they want to be in. They've maybe moved to an area or they plan on bringing family. If you think most of the associates looking to buy are of an age where they're probably getting married or they're probably thinking about starting a family or they have a small family, and that's going to be a big driver. Excuse me. It's the makeup of the practice. Is it fully private? Is it fully NHS? A few years ago, NHS practices, as we all know, were incredibly popular. And that popularity has never gone away. But what we see now, and the most attractive practice is a mixed practice. So any buyer can see they can service their loans because they've got the NHS contract paying them regularly, but also the opportunity to develop on the private side. Because again, if you look at most of our young dentists looking to buy, they are quite aspirational. So they want to develop the private. Aesthetics dentistry is more and more popular. And the demand is also there as well.
Did that mix of income, the desirability of mixing of income, did that change through the pandemic? Was there a shift more towards plan-based income and away from independent private because people were scared about the risk of that not recovering?
Well, one of the most interesting things during the lockdown in the first 3 months when practices couldn't be open, every practice owner I spoke to who had a capitation scheme had benefited from the fact that none of their patients walked away. They had a couple who went on, took holiday for a couple of months, but nobody lost a patient off the capitation scheme. And it became very much their saving grace, to the extent that several practice owners that I know, any new patients they take on board now, they insist that they join the capitation scheme. It's not an option. This is what you have to do if you want to use this. And it's protection, but it's also, again, it's a really reliable source of income. And when the banks are looking at funding, they look at a capitation scheme and say, that's great because we can see how much money you're going to be bringing in every month, as it were, if you had an NHS contract.
On type of practices that are attractive, does it matter freehold or leasehold? Is there, everyone wants a freehold, everyone wants a leasehold, or does it not really matter?
Historically, freehold was a big driver, but when we had the crash in 2008, the banks took quite a hit on property. So they really did struggle on the property element. So moving forward from 2008, which feels like a lifetime ago now, the banks were less keen on freehold purchase and more keen on leasehold. So they'll say we'll lend against the business, but we won't lend against the building. Whereas historically, the fabric of the building was really important for the bank. Most of our, and if you flip it, our principals who own the freehold have the options now to put the freehold into a pension, into what's called a SIP, and then they can turn it into a lease. Most of our buyers would like to buy the freehold at some point, but financially, if they're putting down a deposit of 10 or 20%, depending where they are in the UK, buying the freehold might be a step too far. So we always try and encourage our principals, if they own the freehold and are open to selling it in the future, to put in what's called a preemption right into the lease, which gives the buyer the security that should the building ever be sold, they get first dibs
at market value. So it doesn't make any difference whether you're selling a freehold or a leasehold, as long as it's a desirable practice, is a desirable practice, irrespective of freehold or leasehold.
Yeah, and there's definite tax advantages to the seller should they sell the freehold at the same time as they sell the business at the moment, though that possibly is going to change in the next two budgets, I would think, because they're going to attack, I think, business asset disposal. But also, what we say, if we have the funnel as wide as possible, then we have more choice for them. So if we can market it freehold or leasehold, then it doesn't exclude people who might be looking for one or the other. Is that the old
entrepreneurs relief? That's the old benefit of the 10%, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's liable to come under attack either in the November statement or next March, potentially.
A lot of debt to repay, haven't we?
We are aware.
So. We do. And also, I guess if you don't sell the freehold and you retain it as somebody who's selling your practice, you continue to receive the rental income anyway. So it's not a disaster. It just means you don't get the capital out in one go. You get the rental income, and then you can dispose of the property later on.
And I think that's another part of the conversation, which says you need to look at how much rental yield you'll get from the freehold if you turn it into a lease, compared to how much tax you might save if you sold it in the first place. And if you do it over a period of time, it's very much swings and roundabouts. The other point at the moment is that we are seeing bank valuations. We made a decision to continue valuing at pre-COVID levels because we could explain to anybody why there'd been a dip in income over those few months. The banks are supporting our valuations as we've always been very lucky because they're so robust. Most of the times our valuations come in, the bank are continuing to hit the figures that or align the figures that we are with. But we are definitely seeing freehold values, the banks being very prudent over freehold values, because I think they're really frightened of catching another cold again. So I don't think at the moment it's the most sexy offer to a principal to sell a freehold. I think if they held on to it, they probably would see a benefit in 3 or 5 years' time.
That goodwill business values are holding up. Whereas the freehold element is potentially a negative, maybe not a negative, but a bit of a detractor from the overall deal, because there's the nervousness of the surveyor in what the freehold market might going to become.
Absolutely. And I think if you look in other industries, freehold within those industries might be more challenged, because suddenly there's going to be an awful lot of office space that's available that was very sexy and in demand a few years ago, whereas dentistry doesn't really move from where it is.
And also, on those numbers you were saying, if there's 5,000 plus people out there looking to buy a practice, I imagine that the seller has an amount of control as to whether they choose to sell the freehold or create a lease anyway, because there's a lot more buyers than there are sellers. Is that fair?
No, absolutely. And the biggest challenge that we ever have is if it's leasehold and the landlord isn't the principal, because historically, and we are going back a few decades now, a dentist would set up a squat, would buy the building, would work in it for 30 years, sell it on, and then he would retain the freehold and create a lease. So a lot of our principals used to be the landlords. Over time, that's changed. So we have what's called third-party landlords, and they're not engaged because they're just bothered about renting out their property. So
is there a lesson there on third-party landlords, that if you happen to have one, to sort of make sure you get it sorted or get it in order before you come to sell? Otherwise, you must have numbers of stories where people haven't, and it's cost them money or time or whatever to sort it out at the wrong time.
Mm.
No, absolutely. And when people say, my landlord's lovely, I've known him for years and we play golf on a Sunday, my heart sinks slightly, because the landlord won't have played golf with the new owner and will probably want to take advantage of making the rent more commercial than it might have been in the past. And also, the one thing that I am seeing at the moment is third-party landlords are worried about dental practices, along with any other business, because they don't understand the security of dental practices. So we're not allowed to talk to the third-party landlords. So to get the message across to them that the practice is safe and secure is quite challenging.
It sounds like it.
I suppose, especially if they've got a portfolio of, as you were saying, Liz, offices and maybe retail. Neither of those are doing particularly well, whereas, as you say, dentistry is sort of solid, isn't it?
And that's a shame, isn't it? If you could get through to those people and let them know that it's healthcare, it's dentistry, it's low risk, they're not going to be affected by another lockdown and required to close in any shape or form. I think a landlord's view may change towards how they view dentists.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the challenge that we have at the moment is most practices are having a very good time financially, for a variety of reasons. And the challenge at the moment has to be, is this a spike or is this a trend going forward? And it's too soon for us to tell yet, but most dental practices are having a better year, even with 3 months out, than they'd had the year before.
Make it tricky to value, though, as well, with that. Is it sustainable? What was the reasons? It must be quite hard from a valuer point of view to try and make sure that you've got a robust valuation that isn't sort of over egging the proverbial pudding, really.
It is, but I think that's where experience comes into play, because the methodology that we use to value a practice isn't reliant just on the last 6 months or the last year. We look at so many different areas. We look at what kind of practice it is. We look at what was sustainable in the 2 or 3 years before. And in some cases, they've taken lockdown. They took the first lockdown to take massive advantage of either doing a marketing strategy, putting a new website in, actually moving into cosmetics, aesthetics, which I hadn't done historically. And you can see that it will be sustainable going forward. Whereas if someone was in an area where they've just happened to have a really busy 6-month period, we have to reflect that in our values, because we don't value the future, we value the past. And that has to be the solid robustness of our valuation is based on evidence that we can show, rather than assume that next year is going to be, if this year's this and next year could be double that, which might not be the case.
You can't sort of suddenly say, I've got a 4th surgery, so therefore my practice is going to generate X pounds, so therefore my practice is now worth more money just because I put a 4th surgery.
But also, I think the rule book's been rewritten. Lots of dental practices continue to open, a typical 9 to 5 and perhaps close an hour for lunch. We're seeing lots now that are opening longer hours, and weekends. And I think that rule book of way business generally operated has been rewritten. And I think there'll be people doing things now going forward as part of their ongoing strategy that they never dreamed of doing 18 months ago.
I'm smiling, so I'm just thinking about the post office in our village.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah. Some people have gone
Maybe
the other way.
Yeah.
Some people have gone the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he quite enjoys his short days and his long moans that he hasn't got much customer.
Jump into the end of the process, Liz. So you've got the property side, and then the seller sells, and the money changes hands. There's often discussion about whether the seller needs to stay on post completion or not. Kind of, has that changed? Where's the mood of whether the seller actually needs to stick around after they've got their money and the deal's completed?
I personally don't think it's changed very much at all. Historically, we used to talk to dentists at about 58 when they were starting their succession planning. For the past 4 or 5 years, it's on average have been 52. Because if you look back, it's been a very strong market for many years now, and a lot of our sellers have said. Back in 2013, we had a flux of sellers who just wanted to get away from the pain of CQC as they perceived it to be. But actually, a lot of our sellers have said, I just want to do the clinical work. I want to go back to being a clinician. I don't want to run a business. I don't want all the headaches of HR and employment, which every dental practice I ever go into, HR employment is always one of the red flags that they say I've had enough of. But most of our principals will, without a doubt, would want to stay on for a form of handover. And we always encourage that because that's the easiest way for the transition of the business from one person or one company to another company. And also, we build it into our sales prospectus. So if somebody wants to work 2 days a week, have 10 weeks off in the summer, never work on a Friday ever, and be paid whatever, and the buyer can build that into their cash flow and wants the principal to stay on, then that's what they do. So the person who's buying the practice is very aware of what the principal wants, because actually, when I'm selling a practice to the principal, I want to get him the best deal, but I also want his future to be what he wants it to be. So if he only wants to work on a Tuesday and play golf the rest of the week,
so it sounds like there's a fair amount of choice in there. It doesn't sound like it's mandatory that you need to stay on for, because where people sell to a corporate, they do need to stay on for an extended period of time, don't they?
Well, that's a totally different deal, because every corporate will want the principal to be tied in for 3, some of them are 5 years, and they tie them in by not paying the full amount at completion. So, for example, they might say, we'll give you 80% at completion, and then you'll get the 20% over the 3 years, providing that you maintain the turnover as to where it is, or agree a turnover figure. So it's also about risk appetite, because some of my principals will say, I want 100%, because the minute I sell my practice, I'm no longer in control. And I think it is about risk appetite. But I also think from the corporate point of view, they have to bend slightly if the practices they want are in competition with individuals who will still pay the same amount of money.
Corporates are like, from if you don't hit your target, I sort of get the feeling that if you don't hit your target, you don't get your payment. It's not like a generosity bank. The answer is you have to hit X, you only hit Y, so you've lost 5%. And then I suppose you then got, as you say, Liz, you've got the thing about that you might be better off having 100% of a number in your pocket now, as opposed to maybe 70% of a marginally higher number in your pocket, but then wait 3 or 5 years to get it, and reliant upon the actual delivery of that figure anyway.
And I think, dentists talk to each other. So whenever I meet somebody who says, well, my friend sold to a corporate and this is what happened to him, it becomes folklore, even if it isn't the case. So for a lot of our principals, they don't particularly want to sell to a corporate because they don't want to be tied in. They don't want to miss out on 30% of the value of their practice. But also the corporates own the practice. The principal stays at the practice. The team still moan at the principal because they think he sold out to a corporate, so it's his fault. So sometimes they don't get the best of either world.
And the bulk of practice sales that you're doing to corporates?
No, we are really fortunate in the sense that we sell to corporates, but we will always say that we won't just sell to a corporate. So if we have a practice that we put to market, we put to open market. So we don't just invite the corporates to bid. There are some practices which are only going to sell to a corporate because they are so large and an individual will want to buy them. But what we are seeing, dentists are brilliantly entrepreneurial. So what we do see are associates joining together. They'll buy one practice between them. They sort of learn from that, and then suddenly they want to buy 3 or 4 practices. So we call them the mini corporates, and they're not really a corporate body at all, but that's what they're growing into. So our principals get the choice of the corporates, the smaller corporates, and the individuals. And then they're allowed to choose the person or the entity that they think is right for their practice. And the loveliest thing for me, when I work with principals, is that, yes, they want to get some money in their back pocket to prove that what they've done for the past 20, 30 years has been worthwhile. But they want to make sure their staff are going to be looked after. They want to make sure that their patients are going to be well looked after. And they want to be able to walk down their high street 4 weeks later and someone say, this guy's lovely that's bought your practice, as opposed to, well, who did you sell out to? So they have all those different levels that they want to tick all their boxes. And because we have a strong market, because we vet all our associates to make sure they're financially viable before they go in front of anybody, most of the time we can give a selection of choice so the principal can really make a personal decision. And some make a business decision and say, I just want the most money possible and I'm never going to think about the practice again. And that's absolutely fine. But that's a minority,
the list of things that you reeled off, the amount of non-financial considerations in there is quite long. Yet the common perception is that all people want to do is sell their practice for the most money possible. But like you say, I hadn't thought about the one of, when you're walking down the high street, you want to be able to see your ex-patients and smile and nod and talk to them, as opposed to feel that you've got to cross the road and avoid people because the way that you exited the practice was uncomfortable for you or for the patients.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not unusual for principals to have second or third generation families sitting in the chair. And equally, it's not unusual for them second or third staff. So it's amazing how many practice managers, daughters are now nurses or associates there. So, and they've built a business as clinicians, not as commercial business owners. So their desires to build a team around them or their patient loyalty. How many times do you hear people say, I don't like the dentist, but mine's lovely?
And can the individuals compete with the corporate buyers, prices? Because that seems to be sort of what you hear, isn't it? Oh, corporates have got all the money, they're the ones buying all the practices. Is that...
No, absolutely, without a shadow of doubt. Because the buyers certainly can, because when we value a practice, we're not influenced by who's going to buy it. So we don't put a different value on because it's a corporate buying. We do what we call a sealed bid process. So we put a practice to market, people go and view it. We say it's worth X. If people really want that practice, they can put what's called a premium on, so they can pay a sealed bid. We don't horse trade, so we don't say you need to put another 5 on the end of it or something, because we believe the value that we put out to the market is the actual value. The banks will believe that's the actual value. So if somebody wants to pay a premium, they've got to say, evidence it, and also evidence the fact they have that cash. So from that point of view, sometimes our sellers will earn more than what they expected, but it won't necessarily be driven by a corporate. And you've also got to remember that some of our associates are buying because there's a specific reason. And it's not unusual for people to say, I've walked past this practice for 10 years and my kids go to school there. I live 10 minutes away. I love the building. This is the place I've always wanted to be the owner of.
Purchase. It's not just commercial. And I guess I can see where that would be different to a corporate. A corporate, I guess, pretty much works to a spreadsheet and says, this is the value. Whereas if it's the practice that, you've walked past or is near your kid's school or is close to your parents or whatever it might be, there'll be a little extra emotion that you might pay over and above somebody else. And that might be the difference.
So that's where your premiums come from.
Which means you get it.
I mean, we've got one at the moment where the person who wants to buy it, her family have lived in that area for so long, and the family are supporting the purchase financially because they don't want her to move away.
That's a real non-financial, non-dentistry dynamic, isn't it?
And for anybody else looking at a practice like that, that's really hard to compete with, because that's not based on maths or calculation or value. That's a family working together on an emotional level. Just stepping away from kind of the individual value bits. The process to buy or sell a practice, from the outside looking in, it feels like it's extraordinarily long. Why is the process such a long process? Are there certain things that just have to happen? What is it that's...
From the inside looking out, it is extraordinary. It really is. Yes, it's. I can only compare our sector to pharmacy, and I know that a pharmacy transaction can go through in 2-3 months, and that's not unusual. From our point of view, there are so many external players in the game. Getting all your ducks lined up in a row is really challenging. So we have a buyer and we have a seller. We have a buyer solicitor, we have a seller solicitor. We possibly have NHS England who are there. We have CQC. We have a bank valuer. We have insurance underwriters. We have so many different touch points that it takes us, we would say a good transaction, private would be 4 to 6 months, NHS element, even if it's a mixed practice, you're looking really at 6 to 9 months to get through. And it's really challenging on both sides. It's challenging for the seller to remain motivated when they can see the end is in sight, and they're having to produce a ridiculous amount of documentation. And I say ridiculous in the sense that we buy and sell dental practices. We always insist people use specialist dental lawyers, which they do. And all the specialist dental lawyers buy and sell dental practices all the time. But there isn't a uniform due diligence requirement. So there isn't one set of due diligence questions that everybody uses. So every law firm has their own set of questions. And the seller has to commit to getting this information together. And it can be 70 pages long. And they have to do it in the evenings or at the weekends because their staff are not aware. And if they're lucky, their wife or their partner might be the practice manager, and that can make it a bit smoother. So until they've done their due diligence, the clock doesn't start ticking. And then in the background, you've got CQC requirement, and CQC used to take 12 weeks. They're now saying it can take 16 to 20 weeks. So you can see why there can be delays, but it's just trying to get it all to flow in the right direction and aligning everything so it's all happening
on the due diligence side of things. Is that something that, because obviously that sits with the seller because they need to assemble that package of information, is that something they have to wait until the sale process is underway before they can start, or could they kind of earn some weeks by getting that done in advance?
Yeah, the one thing that we did is we went out to all the law firms and said, well, how do you collate your due diligence? And we put together a guide to due diligence. So we've amalgamated as best we can the areas where it's just general information. And yeah, we also always encourage them to start putting the information together, even when it comes in from the other side solicitor. They might have to move it around or get extra bits. And I always say they can say no if they don't know the answer, because some of the questions are so bizarre that you say, just say no. And then if the buyer solicitor is worried about it, they can ask for more information. Or sometimes the buyer solicitor will be commercial and say, that's fine, I'm not bothered. So it's also about getting the lawyers to work well together. So we always encourage, once we know what side one person is using, then we always encourage the other side to work with a solicitor that we know works well with the other side solicitor. So we don't have unfortunate ego clashing. There's a lawyer
matchmaking service that goes on as well.
I never thought of it that way.
Try and call it a name or something. I don't know, Tinder. Yeah. I know someone's got that one already.
Yeah.
And so you get to the end, and obviously you've been involved in hundreds of transactions. How do you kind of capture that kind of overriding feeling? How do people feel when they get to the end of selling a dental practice? Well, what is it? What is it that is there that euphoric moment? Is it exhaustion? What does it sort of look and feel like for people that might be about to get on this journey?
I think it's a combination of two. I mean, we try and manage everyone's expectations and say it is quite a challenging process. And the one thing that we try and do is make sure that we stay in really regular contact with everybody, even if it's to say nothing's happened this week. Because I think it's really important that people know there is a flow and things are happening. Most of the sellers, it depends on the reasons why they're selling, but if we're doing it to facilitate retirement, it can be tinged with sadness because it's the end of a career and it's the gateway to the next part of your life. And we say some of our sellers are selling to move forward to something really exciting. Others are selling to move away from something they've been demotivated by. So not everybody is coming at it at the same position. And what is interesting, historically, you would see people would own a practice for 20 or 30 years and then retire. Now, it's not unusual for me to be dealing with somebody who I sold a practice to 10 years ago, who've now said, I want to sell because I want to do property, or I want to sell because I found an even better dental practice that I want to go into. So it's slightly more transient than it was historically. But the majority of our sellers, when we get to the end, they're delighted because we got to the end of the process. And what's better for me is when I catch up with them 2 or 3 months later, when it's actually sunk in, when they are doing 1 day a week and playing golf 4 days a week, and they are just enjoying the clinical work, and they haven't got the hassle. When someone says, can I have a chat with you for a minute? They say, no, actually, I'm an associate and I'm going home.
It's life-changing stuff, isn't it?
That's when it's a good time. It's absolutely life-changing. And also from the associates who've bought it, it's stressful for them during the process, because until we get to exchange and completion, it's not legally binding. And the buyers spend a lot of money on additional surveys and additional services. They've got to decide whether to get their notice in or not, and we advise them not to because we don't know. So they're on tenterhooks. And also, they've worked as an associate, and then suddenly they're the ones working later in the evenings to do all the bits and pieces, and they're the one who've got people saying, can I have a word with you for a minute? And they now have to say yes.
A change of position. They've got to change the light bulb, isn't it? That great story. The associate goes and tells the principals the light bulb's broken.
And I wonder how many associates that move into the position of practice owner reflect on how they behaved as an associate in the years gone by and think, actually, I might have do some things differently.
I also think now that there's a big difference in the sense that external services, the associates who buy now are happier to buy in expert services. So HR and employment, which is a massive issue, they recognise the benefit of using a service external to the practice. Equally with CQC, rather than try and do it themselves, they'll buy in an expert service. And we encourage that because we say, you've got to think, how much money can you earn doing what you're doing? How much money is it costing you to bring in an external service? It's going to take all your worries away. And actually, it's mind-blowingly stupid not to do it. I was going to ask the
question. I think that's probably answered it. Is, have you seen the time that you've been managing practice sales that buyers have become, not all of them, have become a bit more business savvy and a bit more business aware?
Without a doubt, without a shadow of a doubt. And I still think the biggest criticism has to say that they come out of dental school with lots of clinical knowledge, but they have very little knowledge about not even just being business owners. I mean, I came across someone recently who didn't realise that what she was being paid as an associate should have a tax bill at the end of the year. She just thought it had all been dealt with. And
that's frightening,
at the end of the year,
especially when you think how much associates can earn, that could be a nasty old tax bill.
There's something fundamentally wrong with the education system, and this is back to school days. How you can have people who don't understand or were never taught that there is tax to be paid. I listened to a podcast. Stephen Bartlett was talking to Noel Clarke, the actor, and the same thing happened to him. The same thing happened to him, and he was earning significant amounts of money. And I remember him saying that he was on stage collecting a BAFTA in a suit that he'd borrowed and shoes he'd borrowed from somebody because he had no money and he had this colossal tax bill, and that's because he got bad advice from an accountant. And that's wrong. That education, and I get the clinical bit is really important, but there's a real hole in people's life knowledge and experience if we're not shaping them to understand basic stuff like tax. And hopefully this podcast will go some way to bridge the gap with some basic business information that will be useful.
Yeah, and I think there's just more. Yes, I think they're generally more entrepreneurial, or their families as well are entrepreneurial understanding. But it's also the understanding that, as I say, to bring in external experts is the best thing you can do, because then you can concentrate on the clinical work. You can concentrate on building your team. The important things that only a principal can do, he can focus or she can focus on, rather than employment and HR. I always talk about that because that's the one thing that a practice owner will say to me when I go in, which will be, I just can't cope anymore.
If you make a mistake,
and legislation
if you make a mistake, it can be very expensive, can't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a terrible example is talking to a practice owner who bought the practice. The principal owned the freehold, created a lease, stayed on as associate. He is now taking them to an employment tribunal and is refusing to do anything about the lease, which is outside the Landlord and Tenants Act. So it's all getting very technical. But it's a minefield that could have been completely avoided if they'd had proper HR and employment advice at the time. So it's really important.
I think it's a really good final tip to leave on. Well,
I have one more tip, and I know we're running out of time. I have one more tip, which is always sounds a bit weird, but people need to have a will. And I say that because sadly I get involved in practice sales where a principal may have died or may have had a catastrophic injury and can't work anymore. And I had one recently, which was COVID related, where the principal, who was been married for several years, ran a private practice, developed COVID and sadly died. And because he hadn't left a will, even though his wife is his next of kin, she can't access the accounts. We can't get the information from the accountant, even though we know the accountant and they know the situation because he died intestate. Yes. So she has no right to this information. The practice can't be open because he was a sole practitioner, fully private. It's turned into, the poor woman's life is devastated, and it's made it a million times worse, purely because he never got around to doing
just going through the floor.
I think it's gone through the floor. I think we've gone beyond.
And the complete and the unnecessary stress of having that added into the mix when you're grieving, to then have to deal with that as well. And it's such a simple fix. Because you can get a will isn't expensive and it's not complicated to sort. No, I think that's a really good point.
No, and I think, I'll often say to people, it's so left field when we're talking, but it's because I experience the aftermath of when it hasn't taken place. It's probably one of my biggest bugbears.
When you see it firsthand, and you see the pain and the grief and the stress it causes, you want to prevent anybody else going through that as well.
Absolutely.
No, great. No, it's an important point, though. We also ask our guests, we always ask them 3 questions at the end. And the first question is, if you could meet anybody, whether they're with us or whether they're not with us, who would you choose to meet? There's no limits.
Yeah, interesting.
I think it'd be Bill Gates and his wife, because I think they are absolutely trying to be as philanthropic as they can be. And I think they are trying to educate where they can educate and invest where they can invest. And it must be really easy when you've got so much money to think you're okay and not think about anybody else.
Good choice. And I think you're right. I think Melinda, his wife, often doesn't necessarily get the credit because Bill and the whole Microsoft thing, he's got more profile. But I think as a couple, they're incredible, absolutely unbelievable. And it wouldn't surprise me if he's hopes to, I think, eradicate malaria in his lifetime. I think that's one of his big goals, isn't it, to eradicate malaria in his lifetime. And I think the way he's going about it, he's on course that could actually happen.
And they live relatively simple life, and they're bringing their children up in a relatively simple way. They're doing it from a position of privilege, but it would be very easy to do nothing from a position of privilege as well. And
our second question is, you can be a fly on the wall. You can be sitting up on the wall, watching down on a situation. What situation would you like to be an observer of?
Yeah, well, slightly weird, but my 2-year-old granddaughter does the most amazing squats I am so envious of. So she just goes down into a squat and she'll be there for ages. And then when she tries to put her socks on or take her socks off, the look of concentration and determination, it always impresses me.
That's really sweet as well. That's nice. And the last one, you've got 2 people and you can do a job swap. So you got 2 people. So one of our other guests was swapping Nicola Sturgeon with Billy Connolly, because you thought it'd be hilarious to see what Nicola Sturgeon looked like doing comedy and Billy Connolly dealing with the Scottish Parliament. So you can switch 2 people about. Who would you move around?
I think Nicola Sturgeon is actually one of the
I said that myself.
We did mention that, yeah.
Yeah, mine would be actually Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer.
Ooh.
Because I I just think it's so easy. And because we negotiate on deals all the time, you really get used to seeing two sides of the story. And you also get used to the fact that there's quite often a backstory that you don't know. And I think it's very easy when you're in the opposition to be critical. However, if you're in that position, how would you deal with it? And the chances are you'd be doing exactly the same. Maybe not over decorating the flat, I don't know. But you'd be doing probably strategically the same things that person would be doing. So I'd like to see them swap.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
But also see how long it took people to notice that they've actually swapped.
If only they'd noticed the hair.
I was going to say the hair would be the giveaway.
That would be the giveaway, I would have thought, yeah.
The hair. Yeah,
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Liz. That's been really good. Really appreciate your time. I'm sure people take a lot of value from this. Lovely. Thanks a lot.
Great.
Cheers.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dentology, where we discuss the business of dentistry. If you like what you heard, please do subscribe where you found this episode. That would be amazing. And also follow us on Instagram.